Okay, so Sarah told me to talk about offline evaluation and analysis. I was like, what's that, Sarah? So I'm going to call this talk instead Probing Your Model's Performance.
Yeah.
So
That's a better title.
yeah, so like you've all trained a model, right? It shows you some nice curves and metrics, and you're like, wow, 0.95, something. That's great. But what does that mean? Like, is it actually going to work for you? Where is your model going wrong? How much is it overfit to your training set? Right? Those are the kind of things we want to learn next. Before I get into that, though, let's do a quick aside into the outputs of your model and the loss functions, because there's been a little bit of confusion. So when you run a machine learning model, you get continuous outputs. And those continuous outputs are generally on the entire real number line, like minus infinity to plus infinity. You just get numbers, right? You might get minus 10, you might get 15, you might get 0. And people call those scores the logits or logits. And that's kind of just semantic because of the other thing. So the other thing is that usually or often we want to collapse those scores onto a real number range of just 0 to 1, because then we can compare them to labels, right? We can compare a very low score of 0.01 to a label of 0 and a very high score of 0.99 to a label of 1 and say we're doing well. So there's usually two different ways that you might map from the real number line to a 0-1 range. The one just treats each output of your model as independent. So that's the sigmoid function. So the sigmoid function just maps, like as you can see on the graph, the real number line onto the 0-1 range. So if you take those top scores and just sigmoid all of them, you'll get the histogram on the bottom. And the second way is a softmax. So softmax says I have scores for several different classes, and I really only want to pick one of those classes. So what it does is it makes all of the scores sum to 1 and preserves the like relative sizes. So if you had a really high score and the rest were low, then after the softmax function, you'll have like 0.9 for the high score, and the rest of the scores will sum to 0.1. And the whole thing adds up to 1. So those are basically the two ways that you might, these are called activation functions, an activation function that you might apply to your logit or logit scores to get onto the 0-1 range. So yeah.
Softmax data going in, it's like sometimes with spectral data you get values that are over 1 in a raster. It just happens. Like, can you? Oh no, that's clipping. That's different. Never mind. Okay, forget it.
Yeah, it's kind of a different thing. So there's this other distinction here that goes along with that sigmoid versus softmax, which is single target versus multi-target classification. So this is a really important distinction, and you want to make sure you know which of these scenarios you're in before you start evaluating your model or choosing the activation function. So in a single target problem, each sample has exactly one label, right? So like I have to choose whether it's a cat or a dog, right? That's a single target problem. And a multi-target problem is like for every class that I've taught my model about, it can independently predict whether the class is there or not. So in the image on the right, is there or is there not a dog? Is there or is there not a cat? So that's a very different type of problem, right? The single target problem will use the softmax activation function and cross entropy loss. And the multi-target identification problem will use a sigmoid activation function and binary cross entropy loss. So those loss functions are just matched to those activation functions. They're just a loss function that makes sense for that problem. If you want to go look at the math, you can, but all you need to know is like, that's the appropriate loss for that kind of problem. Does everyone understand the conceptual difference between single and multi-target?
Does anyone in this room have a multi-target problem? Do you have a single image and you're treating it as a classification problem where you want to predict multiple things? But it's only classification, not detection.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean.
So detection is a way to treat a multiple objects in the thing problem as an actual single target problem, but by first defining what your targets are and allowing there to be multiple targets. It's a little complicated.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone here is doing multi-target classification right now.
Yeah, Michaela is.
You are.
I don't know
Okay,
if anyone
fine.
else
Cool.
actually
Never
is.
mind.
But yeah, it's something to keep in mind. So then if each bounding box has one label, then it's back to a single target problem, right? But if each bounding box for some reason could have multiple labels, then you're again in a multi-target. So in PyTorch, there's this kind of, it's just a computational efficiency trick, but the softmax in the cross entropy or the sigmoid in the binary cross entropy are combined into one function. So that's why you're looking at your model and you don't see that activation function as like a layer in your model, because they've just smashed it in with the loss function because they can do it more efficiently that way. Okay, so that was that little aside. So to get into model performance, I'm just going to take a little hypothetical example where I've trained a model to detect aliens, right? And now I have this question of like, okay, I have this training set where I like drew some aliens and it detects them really well, but I really don't know like if my model is going to perform in the real world. So the kinds of questions we're asking is like, will my model actually detect aliens in this upcoming year's data if they appear, right? Like that's a hard question. So like, I'm going to throw up a bunch of questions. Think about what you might do with your model to try to answer these. And then we'll come back to them at the end and see if we have a sense of how to answer them. So why does my model miss 50% of the aliens? What non-alien things are in my data are being confused for aliens and the other way around? Why does my model work on last year's data, but it doesn't work on this year's data? What changed? Do I just need more labeled data to make my model better? What is the probability that the sample has an alien? Is my model paying attention to the right stuff in my images? And why does my model suddenly detect lots of aliens when I happen to know that there actually aren't any? So those are the kinds of questions that we need to probe the model beyond just our validation metrics for. So I'm going to talk a lot about kind of like holistic and qualitative evaluation as well as quantitative evaluation, because yesterday's lecture with Sheer was like a lot of the quantitative metrics, right? But we want to get this feel, this intuition for what our model's doing, and that'll help us decide how to make it better, right? So histograms are a very, very useful tool for getting a feel for model performance. So when we plot a histogram, what are we plotting? We're plotting the raw outputs of the model, so the logit scores, on the number line, right, as a histogram. And we usually, if we have labeled data, we'll plot a separate histogram for the positive samples and for the negative samples. So all we're saying is, like, what is the distribution of scores that come out of my model when the class of interest is not present, and what's the distribution of scores that come out of my model when the class is present? And a lot of the other metrics that you talk about, you can start to visually see just by looking at the histogram. So a lot of metrics will use a threshold, right? So a threshold is like just a line somewhere on this histogram. And if I pick that threshold in green, I can think about precision, right? What is precision here? Precision is on the right side of that threshold, what fraction are actually positives and what fraction are not, right? So I have really good precision over there because there's not many orange samples. Oh, I mislabeled my histogram. Sorry, guys. There should be positive samples, right? And negative. That's really confusing. Yeah, so, wow. Anyways, does that make sense? Can you ignore this or should I go change it? So this is a threshold that we've chosen, right? So the blue are the positive samples, even though I wrote negative, and the orange are the negative samples. So the positive samples are generally scoring higher. And if we pick this threshold, then only a few of the samples that don't actually have the class have scored above our threshold. And a lot of the samples above the threshold are actually the ones we're looking for. And then as you change the threshold, you can see visually how that ratio will change, right? So now we're getting almost all of the blue ones, but now we're getting a bunch of the orange ones as well. So I look at histograms as like a first level interpretation of how the model is separating the classes. Okay, so yeah.
Sorry, is there like a benefit of applying a histogram of the raw logits versus the softmax transform scores?
You can definitely do either. You can plot the histograms on the softmax scores, or like on your sigmoid scores if your activation is a sigmoid. The nice thing about this is that I find it easier to visualize, in part because sometimes the two distributions actually look pretty much like Gaussians. And so you can kind of visually like distinguish those distributions and see like what kind of separation you have a little bit more easily. With the 0-1 range, things kind of just get smushed in, and then so there's like a bunch of samples on the edges of those, and it's just a bit harder to visualize for me. But either one is totally fine.
And then, so this seems like a binary classification. So for multi-class, would you do like a one versus all for each class?
Yes, yeah, a one versus all would be a good histogram to start with. You can also do something where you kind of have a confusion matrix, but each cell is like score. Yeah, I could show you later. I don't really know how to describe it with my hands, but yeah. Okay. So yeah, what data are we going to use for model evaluation? So it's not just our validation data, right? It's not just our test data. We can get a sense for model performance, first of all, from the training data. Don't forget that your training data is a valid way to evaluate your model's performance. If you haven't learned very well on your training data, then you probably don't even need to go on to test data. You should probably keep working on how you can train your model to learn your training data better. Of course, your validation data and your test data, which is this separate labeled data set that you've held out from any training or validation, right? And so a lot of you guys are probably at the point now where it's time to take your trained model, apply it to your test data, and see how things are doing. Another way you can evaluate your model is by applying it to data that you don't even have labels for. And what are you going to do with that because you don't have the labels, right? Well, you can still do something like test whether your model is useful by, for instance, looking at the highest scoring outputs of your model and seeing if they're actually the class that you're looking for. So all four of these data types are valid for ways to evaluate your model. Okay, let's talk a little bit about evaluation during model training, and then we'll move on to more of your test set stuff. So I think a lot of you are using Comet or WAN-B. I just want to put a plug up there for these platforms. They're logging platforms that do real-time logging of metrics during training. So this is just a screenshot of one of my like web views in WAN-B, weights and biases, where it's logging the loss function, it's logging some metrics over time. So it's a really good way to just get a sense of the quantitative metrics that Shir was talking about yesterday. The other thing that I really like to do in these platforms is they'll allow you to log tables of your samples. And so then anytime you're looking at a model, or as soon as you start training even, you can go and just check out if those augmented samples or unaugmented samples generally look like you expect them to. They've been pre-processed approximately in the way that you expect. The labels that are on them actually match what's in the sample, right? This is just a really good gut check when you first start training that things are actually going the way you expect them to.
I would just like to add that when my model is not learning, I would say 9 times out of 10, it's because that is wrong.
Yeah.
It's because somehow the labels have been mismatched, or the augmentation I'm using is doing something weird, like turning all the images completely black. So this is not only a useful sanity check, it will save you a lot of headache.
Yeah, like I spent years trying to convince everyone in my lab that they should like manually plot and save samples and look at them before training, but no one ever did it. So when I realized I could just put it in my pipeline and it would happen as soon as I started training, it's prevented a lot of those types of errors, or at least it's easier to find them. Okay, so I'm just gonna ask a couple questions about what you think is going on. So I started training a model. Here's my validation mean average precision and my training mean average precision. Why is my validation mean average precision higher than the samples it actually gets to train on? Anyone have an idea? In this case, they're both balanced, but that's a good idea. Yeah, that's a great. So there's none of the same images in training and validation here, but sure, like it might be learning something from the training set that's applied to the validation set. Why else might the validation performance be better than the training performance?
Maybe a mix of mean average precision loss in my implementation, and what's really happening is that both curves are kind of exploding.
Okay. Maybe you misimplemented something. There's another reason.
Like not done, just like in a where it's only looking at validation sets.
We've been through a couple epics, let's say.
I bet I know what you're looking for. Because at training time, you're doing heavy augmentation, which is making the images harder to classify, but at test time, you aren't. So you have clean examples.
Okay, Sarah gets a piece of candy. Right. So there's this interesting thing where sometimes your training set is actually harder than your validation set because you're doing all kinds of crazy augmentation and making obscuring things. And maybe on some samples, you can't even see the thing the model is supposed to see, right? So that's something you might see, just to be aware of. Now, if we look further, like that doesn't continue happening in this case, right? The validation set actually starts to get worse while the training set gets better. What's happening now? It might be learning something about the augmentations, yeah, or more generally, it's overfitting to the training set, right? And so if we keep training, eventually, like all of these models, even if you pick a relatively small one like ResNet 18, they're completely over-parameterized, right? They can just memorize things if you let them. And so if you train for long enough, you're going to overfit on your training set. And so this is why it's really important to have other sets of data that you're comparing the performance to. Okay, so what happens next? You've trained a model, you get all these metrics, they're kind of saturating, they're kind of high. You're like, wow, I have like 95% recall on everything. Like, that's pretty awesome. But maybe if I tweak a hyperparameter, like I can get 98, or maybe this one class that's at 80 can go up to 90. Should I keep tweaking my hyperparameters to squeeze out a higher performance metric? Or should I do something else? So I think almost everyone is going to be at this point pretty soon if you're not there already. And probably you're going to try to tune your hyperparameters. And I actually don't think that's what you should do next. I think almost all of the time when you get to this point, the next step is not to try to like modify your learning rate or train for longer or change your augmentation. The step when you get to this point is, okay, my model learned from the information I gave it, right? My model learned about the training set and it even generalized to the validation set. So now I need to test it on my test set and I need to look at specific examples of where the model isn't doing what I want it to do. So that's what I'm really going to talk most about today. How do we figure out like, okay, the validation performance is fine, but like, is my model actually doing what I want it to do? And in which cases is it failing?
Now you're getting information. How we treat the model.
Yeah, okay, so there's kind of different philosophies on this, but you have to look at the test data set eventually, right? And I don't think the right answer is look at the test data set once you've picked a model that you're going to use forever, because that won't be the most useful model. You're going to apply it to some new data set, and then you're going to realize it's not doing what you want it to do because there's some problem with generalizability. And maybe that means like, okay, if you now like pick parameters on that set or whatever, now you need a new test set. But the answer isn't really to just never look at the test set. Do you have one?
No, I mean, I think that this is essentially like philosophically, if you want to really truly use a test set as like representative of, I am using this model on completely new data and don't know anything about it, then that test set, you would need to never look at it. In practice, we don't really have enough data to be that principled, unfortunately. And so often what we're actually doing is we kind of have our training and our validation and our somewhere between a test and validation set where we're actually using it to try to understand how the model generalizes or how the performance of the model expands. This is the very important point, with the understanding that now when we want to deploy that model somewhere else, we need to do this process again.
Yeah,
we have to probe that as if it's a new test set. We can't just say, well, I saw with that test set that this was the thing that generalized best, and this is what was going on, and now I'm good, and I'm just going to use this model like la la la. It has 90% accuracy.
Yeah, and I'll come back to a little bit of that generalizability stuff.
If you haven't like started tweaking hyperparameters to fit your validation set, wouldn't you expect to sort of get the same information looking at failing cases in the validation set, and then you would have to sort of gain the test set?
Great question. It totally depends on how you've generated your validation in your test set. So in practice, what I might often do is the validation set would be pretty similar to the train set. It might be a subset where I've taken certain devices from that recorded data and subset them. Hopefully I haven't taken like photos from the same device because that's not really even that different from my training set. But the validation set might be more similar to your train set than some held out test set. Yeah. But it comes back to what Sarah was saying, which is like, even if you have a test set that you've never seen before, and it's like some great labeled data set that's like totally like transferability, just because you transfer to that set doesn't mean your model can transfer to some other set, right? And so like the best test set is the test set that's representative of the data where you want to use your model. So we'll come back to that a little bit. Okay, so the first thing you might ask when you have like a pretty good model, but it's not good at everything, is do I just need more data, right? So this is a slide I just stole from Sarah's presentation. I don't even know what it is, but
Caltech camera traps, classification performance on crops.
yeah. Okay, so the important takeaway here is like less data, worse performance, right? And not only less data, worse performance, but it's these classes that like barely have any examples that do really badly, and everything else is actually like doing pretty well. And so the point here isn't just like your imbalanced data set with a few rare classes is going to do poorly. I think the point is that like if you were able to just get like 20 samples of some of these rare classes, all of a sudden like your model is going to be able to learn something pretty useful. So maybe the answer here is like, can I just get a handful of samples for these rare classes? Because it seems like when the model at least has a handful of samples, it does pretty well. So sometimes the next step is just go get more data. But the other really important next step is inspecting your samples. So this is like really, 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 really important. I want everyone to be looking at samples of their model's predictions on train, validation, test set examples from their data, right? So what does this look like in practice? You can get a feel for your model's performance, both on labeled and unlabeled sets, just by looking at the scores your model gives to samples, whether they have labels or not. So you might just build a big grid of images. So sometimes you just like make a big grid, like write a script that generates like 500 images in a big table. And you can just start looking through them, and you can stratify the samples that you generate, for instance, by the model's score output. So maybe you want to look at like the highest scores on a specific class, right? What is the model most confident is a raccoon? So I can get a sense of, is it actually like learning the raccoon class correctly or not? The other thing you can do is not just look at the highest scoring samples for a class, but also like what the model is missing, right? So like what are the intermediate or low scores for classes that have a specific label? And is there some difference that I can see kind of just by looking at these and getting a feel for the images that's confusing the model, right? So there's kind of two different approaches to doing this. You can take the positive labels for one class, and you can look at the lowest scoring samples out of your model for that positive label. Or you can look at things that are kind of like in this intermediate score where the model isn't sure what to do with them. Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways.
Go back. I think the fun thing to point out, if you look at these two examples, like to go back one more slide. So clearly the model is learning that raccoons most frequently show up at night, right?
Right.
So raccoons that show up during the day, it's mispredicting a lot more frequently. And that's the kind of intuition that you'd like to build in terms of like,
yeah,
is going.
Yeah, exactly. So like, what's the difference between these two sets of images, right? There's a lot of differences that your eye will pick out immediately. And they're not so much about like raccoons. There's something more general. There's something about day versus night, or like black and white versus color, right? So sometimes you'll realize that your model is learning something that's not actually the point of what you're trying to learn.
So when you say plot least confident images, does that mean, let's say I have a 3-class classifier, I want to plot all of the things where like the 3 probabilities in the end are very close to each other, like 0.33, 0.33, 0.33.
That's one way to do it. How would you approach it?
I do all 3, right? So I would say like, let's take everything that's actually, that I know from my ground truth is actually class A, and let's look at the ones where I'm correct. Like my model is getting a true positive. I'm correctly predicting it's class A, and it is class A, and the scores are very high. And that's like what is easy for my model. And then I say, now what are the things where the true label is class A and my confidence score for class A is very low? And then I look at, that's what that second one was, which is basically what did the model actually predict when these all are actually raccoons, but the model's predicting something else. And these are now like the hardest examples for that class. So the ones where I'm like making making strongest mistakes. You can do that for each class separately, but you can also look at what Sam brought up and what you just brought up, which is like, what are the images look like when this vector of probabilities, or not probabilities, scores, is really similar across everything. Like it just has no idea what's going on. And all of this is just cool ways to probe visually and build intuition. And if I just looked at a number, I would never have understood. Actually, it's just learning this very strong prior, which makes sense that raccoons show up at night, because most of the data of raccoons we have is at night. Makes sense.
Here's a short question, like, would you see that, for example, because in photos are taken at night, they are grayscale and not RGB. So that's based on like the weird stuff in the architecture, learning that you have just one channel. Put it happen and then you have to figure it.
Yeah, or what we actually did in practice to try to address this is we tried like, well, what if we add some augmentation that randomly converts images to grayscale during training time?
Yeah.
It turns out that actually darkness and grayscale are on 2 different dimensions, so it didn't really work, but it was an idea.
But yeah, your model can learn anything from the information you give it, right? So like, if there's just like a red record icon in the upper left of a lot of your positive samples, it's going to learn that red record icon as a feature because it's a really good way to predict that positive sample, right?
I have a really annoying story about this. So we'd explicitly explored this with Wildlife Insights early on. We had like some big set of data, and we were exploring whether the logos from the camera traps, the different brands of camera traps, was affecting classification performance. And we probed in a bunch of different dimensions. And we were like, maybe we just have enough data right now where it doesn't seem to be an issue, because we didn't see too much variety in performance. And it's actually pretty hard to systematically crop out those logos without cropping out any important information, because sometimes you have to crop out the bottom of the screen and then the animals at the bottom of the screen. So we were like, okay, it looks like after this really systematic evaluation that it's actually okay to leave the logos in the images. It's not causing an issue. We're not seeing major changes in predictive performance if we remove or keep the logos during training and eval. And then, like 2 years later, all of a sudden, systematically, after like adding a bunch of new training data, like stuff that was consistently completely accurate before, like really easy stuff that we used to be really good at, things like deer and like wolves and stuff, all of a sudden, every single one of them started being predicted as nutria, which is like a weird species of invasive beaver. And we're like, what the heck is going on? And it took us a really embarrassingly long time to realize that a new organization had come in as like a trusted partner, where then we use their data as labeled training data. They were explicitly studying nutria. They were only using Bushnell cameras. They'd only uploaded a ton of images of nutria that were Bushnell cameras. And now basically the model had learned anytime you saw a Bushnell logo, it was a nutria. So like things that used to be good all of a sudden became very bad because we changed our training data and added this in. And now we have to systematically remove the logos. But it was one of these things where we knew that could be a problem. We tested it. We were like, okay, we convinced ourselves it's actually okay. And then in fact, later it turned out it was a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I've wondered about that a lot, but with bounding boxes, like that's only for whole image classification.
I mean, the
Yeah,
logos can still show up, but it helps a lot because if you're classifying on that box, like it does remove a lot of these issues.
And I'll show a way to address that issue even when you're not doing bounding boxes in a few slides.
So that's literally the equivalent of writing the word nutria, like on the slide.
Yeah.
for the model to learn.
Basically.
Yeah.
They
And if
think
we-
they're Bushnells, but they're, yeah.
Yeah, and it was just, I think the thing that made me so mad about it is because I fucking know better. And it, like, it took us like 2 months to figure this out. It's so embarrassing.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So like, how do you stratify your samples, right? So we talked about look at the lowest scoring positive. So in the histogram, that's like the left tail of the blue samples, right? The highest scoring negatives. Why is it giving really high scores to some of those orange samples that are in the right tail, right? So in general, it's those like overlapping sections of the histogram that are the confusing ones. And especially the worst ones are the blue ones that are way down here and the orange ones that are way up here. But there's other ways you could stratify your data, right? So depending on what you're interested in, it might be useful to stratify like by some sort of natural variation or like stratification in your data, like site or location. Because sometimes if you just look at a few images from one site, you'll realize, oh, something is going wrong at this site, even though it's doing well at the other sites. Other ways like by date or also by specific confusions in your confusion matrix. So if you look at your confusion matrix and there's like one cell that's popping out that's not on the diagonal, it makes sense to go into some specific samples for that cell and say, why is this getting confused for this? Okay, so what is your model looking at? So this gets back to what Sarah was talking about, right? So if we do bounding boxes, if we're doing object detection, we actually tell our model, you need to tell us which part of this image you're paying attention to and classifying, right? So it's pretty easy to tell if, for instance, the model started circling, I don't know if this is actually part of the sample, but if it started circling like the timestamp, yeah?
Yeah.
Is it like learning covariates accidentally based on?
No, I don't think so. And now with wild weapons, I could crop that stuff out.
Okay,
But if you have the same brand of camera for all your data, it doesn't really matter.
okay.
It'll like pretty much learn to.
Unless it learns like what morning is.
Yeah, but it'll learn that implicitly from the colors of the morning.
Yeah.
So.
No, I'm guessing.
But if an animal is really only active in the morning or something, and there's a timestamp like around, you know what I mean?
So my question to you is that information, if you crop out the timestamp, is that information not included implicitly in the pixels? I can tell looking at these by shadow directions or whatever that it's morning anyway. So it's still something the model can learn with the timestamp. Now, if you give it that cheat code or that shortcut, maybe it will learn it in a not useful way. So
Yeah. So yeah, easy to interpret the outputs, right? If it started paying attention to the wrong things, we would see that in the bounding boxes it produces. But if we're just doing classification, yeah.
I guess I have a question about time. You know, say like propping up time. The whole idea of like adding like actual metadata regarding like time across the year mostly, and then like location is kind of doing that exact same thing anyway.
Yeah.
So I guess there'd be some reason to leave it in intentionally because you just know that those are the active periods and one that and likely be there.
Yeah.
Just kind of just exploring.
Yeah, so those pieces of metadata, you'll get people who tell you shouldn't use it at all, and people who will say, no, we'll use them because it's useful. And so the important like distinction between those camps is really what you're going to end up doing with your model, right? Because if you're going to use your model to make predictions or like make some like conclusion about the animal's daily pattern, you can't give it the time of day as a covariate, right? It can't be a piece of information. But if you're doing something that's unrelated to time of day with your model, then maybe it's okay to include that as metadata. Yeah. Great. Yeah, that comes up a lot in acoustics because people will be like, oh, can we give the location of this recorder, right? But then you end up doing something like a habitat distribution model. And like exactly what you're trying to learn is like something that you gave it in the metadata and the model just is already biased. Okay. Yeah, right. So it turns out there's a way to ask the model what it's paying attention to spatially in an image, even with a classification problem. So these methods are usually based on original paper that called it GradCam, so gradient class activation maps. So what that means is you're looking at the gradients of the model, the pieces of information that the model is using to train its own weights, and you're looking at them for a specific class. So that's why it's called a class activation map. And you're going to move backwards through the layers of your model from the loss that's down at the bottom all the way up through the different convolutions. And depending on which of those convolutions you're looking at, you might see different levels of like low level versus high level detail. But basically, this method is able to highlight the regions of an image that are most strongly influencing its decision to predict that class. So this is a really nice way to get a sense for why is my model predicting an owl in this image, right? So it's looking at the eyes and the shape of the head. And it's not just looking at something in the background, for instance. We've been using this. So I haven't used FlashTorch, but I checked out the page and it looks very similar to the one I use, which is just called PyTorch GradCam. So both of those are tools that you can easily implement in PyTorch to take a look at how your samples are, like what the activation maps of your samples are. And generally, like in practice, what it means is you're going to like wrap your entire PyTorch model object in this other object that someone has implemented in their class. and then run like a backwards or like a generate cams method on it.
Is there anything for YOLO maybe that would work?
Does anyone know if there's class activation maps in YOLO?
I
It's
think,
more, yeah, it's more complicated in detection and there's not really things off the shelf, but if you wanted to set up like a multi-model pipeline where you crop the bounding boxes and then train a classifier, then you could use this as a classifier. I mean, actually, it's not also.
No, go ahead.
There is a found a people, but not that it's going to, because it's more interested in about what it is, and okay, fine. I can't zoom in to this. You're trying to figure out.
so this is kind of a pointer to like what this type of thing is good at or not. It's not super great at like fine-grained detail. There's actually a student in Pietro's lab, Mihar Kondapaneni, who's explicitly exploring how to make these more informative in a fine-grained sense. Because sometimes if you're doing like bird species classification across different species of birds, it'll basically like highlight the bird for all of them. And you're like, great,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah.
But if you're doing something like multi-species where now you're doing like the camera traps, that'd be like deer and bears and whatever. Now this is potentially coarse-grained enough and again, like you said, large enough in the image that you'll get some informative stuff out of this. So there is a dimension of this might not be as useful for you if you have really small objects or if all of your classes look very similar. There's not very good a fine-grained distinction.
That works with segmentation models, like you have multi-spectral imagery, you're trying to see what it is in that you're, a lot of times I look at 3-channel imagery with like different bands to get a sense like it's just gonna pop out, like will that, something like that tell me in that way?
I have absolutely seen people run GradCam on satellite, like multi-class segmentation, but I don't know how they do it. I just seen the visuals in papers. So people have done stuff like this for remote sensing imagery. I don't know if it's multispectral. I don't know what it's actually demonstrating. So it's something we can look into.
Yeah, I think in other words, your question is in remote sensing, we often feed in like a lot of bands,
Yeah.
a lot of meta information, a lot of additional features, but we're feeding in so much information that sometimes we're feeding in so much and we make the model really slow, and then we want to do a down selection of which features are the most, which channels are the most important. Is it red, green, and NIR, for example?
Yeah, it'd be helpful
then-
to know that. And then-
Yes, it's a different axis. Like earlier we were plotting on the XY direction.
Right.
And now we want to plot the importance on the feature in the channel direction. So that's one important difference, which does make the out of the box tools a little bit harder to use. But there is ways to do it.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like harder to.
I'll talk to you later because I have other questions.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, I was just going to show one more example with sound. So in this case, it actually is doing something. There's kind of 2 different ways you can use these models, and then we'll move on. But the first one is just like a very broad scale, like what region is this paying attention to? And the second one is called like the gradient back propagation, which is actually like the specific pixels of the image. So the reason this is super broad is because when you get to the end of your network, like your features have been compressed spatially into maybe like a 7x7 array. So you no longer have like pixel level features. So at the end of your network, it's going to be like this. And then if you propagate all the way back through, you'll get something more fine-grained. Okay, let's talk about generalizability and domain shift a little bit. So you've probably all seen a plot like this where you have a validation set, right? You do really well, and then you test it on other sets and you don't do as well, right? This is like what's going to happen to your model because your test set is somehow different from your validation set. And so the question is like, why is it different? Why is it doing worse? What is it about my test sets that's harder, or that the model hasn't learned something as well as it has on the validation set? So let's just talk about a few of the reasons why the test set might be different or harder. The first thing is like, there's going to be some like domain shift in your data that might just be intrinsic to like the types of sensors or the types of like monitoring that you're doing. So in acoustics, we often have like really clean labeled samples that look really nice, right? And then we get into the field and there's like all these other birds in here, and like this is that thing that was really clean on the previous slide. And I think there's, the analogy in images is often that something might be more distant or obscured, or the visibility conditions are a lot worse. There's a lot of like just very large shifts that if you look at them visually, there's an obvious difference between your training and validation data and some of the harder samples in your test set. The other thing that can happen is that something brand new will pop up in your test set that your model just hasn't seen before. So this is an example from Michael Getz from our group, right? So he trained a model with training data that looks like this. It's doing object detection on insects, right? And the model actually trained really well right off the bat. And it was able to like pick up insects in the test data. But it also continuously was picking up this little bolt that happened to be at the bottom of these images because there was no bolt in the training data, and it roughly has some of the same characteristics of the insects. And so we immediately knew like the model wasn't actually necessarily learning something super specific to insects, but something that also applied to bolts in the new test set, right? So this is the kind of generalizability issue that you're not going to be able to see until you apply your data to the specific type of samples that you're actually going to use it on, right? So like you can imagine like a million variants of there was a bolt in our test set that wasn't in our training set that are just really impossible to predict unless you actually have a sample of the data that you plan to use your model on. So it kind of comes back to that idea that just because your model generalizes to a new data set, it doesn't mean it's going to generalize to the data set that you choose to apply it on. And so the answer to this really is the only answer is look at how the model is doing on the data that you actually want to use it on.
And if you didn't want to build a bolt detector model at that point, would you have to put some images with bolts labeled not insect back into the training data? Like,
So that's like the most straightforward solution to this problem is you just go get some samples that have this new thing that's a false positive in your new data set. And then you train the model with them as negatives so that it stops detecting them.
So this is explicitly what we're on mega detector V5. And the reason we're on mega detector V5 is we basically just kept finding sort of general issues like this. So one was like, oh, wow, mega detectors doing really bad, like between V2 and V3, it was like mega detectors doing really, really bad at animals in trees. Like anytime you have arboreal camera traps, which there were a lot of, for some reason, people coming to us wanted to use mega detector on arboreal camera traps. The animals would be at different orientations than the model was used to. They're climbing up tree trunks. They're not like on the ground. So we then were like, okay, cool. Thanks for showing us this thing where everything is failing. Can we write an MOU, get some of your data? We went and labeled it. We added it to training. We started doing better on our arboreal camera traps. Now we're like, all right, now we're going to go to like V4 because we realized every single time we get a bait trap, we're starting to just really consistently detect the bait trap itself as opposed to the animals. Now let's go in, let's like get from a bunch of different people in the community images of bait traps and add them in so the model learns not to recognize the bait trap. And this kind of iteration is practically like how deployed models work. You learn from the users what it's getting wrong, and then you add that back to training and you iterate. And just will never end.
Yeah, and just one little like distinction. So those are, Sarah gave two very similar examples, but one is harder than the other, right? Because a false positive, you just like, you have tons of images probably with the false positive. And so you can easily just like gather a bunch of those bolts and put them back into your model. A false negative is more difficult because like that's a rarer sample type, right? It's like it's missing something. I actually have to go annotate that something. But both of those require the same strategy.
Abandoned class is the model might start to misclassify an insect as a false, So you like in my case, I have like parts of plants that they look like an insect, and there are like a lot. So I'm worried if I go down this path of labeling that as like plant parts, then it might start to label actual insects as plant parts.
I think what we did was instead of actually building a bait class that we would try to get the model to predict, we just put images that had bait traps in them that were not labeled as anything. So it was telling it that that was background. Now that's a little nuanced, and actually I'm not really sure in the end whether explicitly trying to make the model predict this confusing class or not is better. That's something you might need to explore. But what you're worried about is very reasonable, in terms of like, if you now give it another class, that's something you don't want it to predict, but that shows up way more than the thing you care about. It is a very reasonable concern that it might start mispredicting the thing you care about. And that's something you should just probe. And I don't think there's any of us could tell you for your data and for your confusions, what exactly will happen.
Yep. Great. Okay, so just to recap, like what are some of the things that can cause domain shift performance drop? So somehow the samples in your real data set might be messier or more difficult or dirtier than your training samples. There's going to be new stuff. There's going to be some new background. And then the other thing that I didn't mention in the previous slides is class distribution shift. So in addition to learning like features of your classes, the model gets information about how frequent classes are. So that goes back to the discussion we were just having. A common class incentivizes the model to predict that class more often to optimize its loss function, right? And you could write a loss function that tries to account for that. But in general, if you train a model with some distribution of classes and you like use it in a problem where the distribution of classes is different, it's going to not perform as well because it has learned something about the distribution of classes in your training data. So we can talk kind of throughout the next week or so about like whether you want to balance your training data and how to avoid or account for this class imbalance shift. But in general, like generalizing to new data is really hard. It's not something that you're just going to like do because you like you know use the right augmentations or you use the right loss function. Like it's always going to be hard because there's always going to be something in this new application that your model hasn't seen before. And so that kind of brings up the question of like, how generalizable does your model actually need to be, right? So maybe we could try like to make this super generalizable model, and we could continue like trying it on a new set, finding what doesn't work, adapting it, trying it on a new set, like adding training data, right? You could go forever. But the reality is like your model has some application. And so like if you can train on a subset of data from the actual place you want to use your model, then at that point, your model doesn't really need to be generalizable, right? It's kind of like an extrapolation versus interpolation problem. If you have a random set of labeled data from like that's representative of the cases where you want to use your model, and your model does well there, who cares if it doesn't do well when you move it across the world, right? Like the model should be good for the place you want to use your model. So like investing in project-specific training data specific to the place and time you actually plan to use your model is often like a very good investment of time. And then this other question that I kind of alluded to in the previous slide, should you allow your model to learn from class imbalance? So basically the practical difference is, are you going to train your model with a distribution of classes that you think looks like the distribution that will appear in your real data? Like some classes are really common, you put a lot of training samples, rare classes, less training samples. Or do you train your model with balance, like it sees 1,000 of every single type, even if I have to reuse the rare classes because I don't have enough training samples? And so it really comes down to this idea that like learning is biased, right? Your model is going to be biased because it's going to learn from whatever data you give it. And so you kind of have to decide consciously whether you want your model to be biased or to learn some class indifference or to learn something specific about your domain.
And also balance is another bias.
Yeah, that's kind of the point I'm trying to make.
You're choosing to bias your model towards something balanced.
Yeah. Right. So basically like your model is incentivized to predict the things that it sees the most because it will optimize performance that way. So you're either going to incentivize your model to predict everything evenly, or you're going to incentivize your model to predict on like based on some distribution of samples that you've given it.
So if you balance, you might get a model that is biased towards finding the rare classes more often in the training data then, essentially because it's like rewarded because it saw zillions of those in the test data because it saw zillions of those in the training data. Yeah,
right. So you could kind of think of it as unbiased in the sense that it's as likely to predict any class as any other. But given the truth that some classes are more common and some classes are more rare, then it's relatively biased towards the rare classes. Okay, we have 5 minutes, but I will not show all of these slides, but I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we can do with continuous scores. So remember that like we often like use a threshold and make a 0 or a 1 prediction or like a box or a not prediction out of our model. But the actual scores themselves coming out of the model might be useful in the fact that they contain like continuous information rather than binary information. So I'm just going to show a bunch of histograms up here just to give you a sense for the kind of things you can look at in a histogram. So when you look at a histogram of unlabeled data, maybe you made predictions on an unlabeled data set. How can you draw something useful out of that? Well, the first thing you can do is you can just compare that to the histogram of some labeled set, right? And maybe like it looks exactly the same. It's not going to look exactly the same. But the point is like, if you know the distribution of scores for your positive set, you may be able to see that distribution kind of with your eyes appearing in your unlabeled data, even without labeling anything. You might also be able to see that that distribution is just missing from your labeled scores. So maybe this histogram looks like that positive class just isn't even present, right? Without even going and labeling anything. That doesn't mean you're sure it's not present, but it's a visual kind of like intuitive difference between the two histograms. The thing that can happen in practice, though, is that your entire distribution of scores for some new application might be shifted from the distribution of scores on your training or validation set. And this is really important to keep in mind when you think about like quantitative metrics that you're going to apply to a new data set, and especially about calibration. I was going to talk about calibration. I'm not going to have time, so we can talk about it a little bit later if you want. The other thing that might happen is like the classes are present and have the same distribution of scores, but now there's like only a few positive classes, right? So you're going to get this like long right tail in your unlabeled data set, which you hope a lot of these like outliers are actually coming from this positive class that have the higher score distribution. And this is important when we think about the metrics again, because imagine that we went and like labeled all of these samples now. So we can actually see that like there's this positive class that's pretty rare, and they're scoring in general kind of higher than the negative class. But if we were to use one of our like metrics, like for instance, the precision of our classifier, right? So up here at some threshold, we actually had really good precision. Like maybe we had 80% precision. 80% of the samples above this threshold were actually true positives, right? But even with the same like mean and standard deviation of the positive and negative score distributions, now that our positive class is rare, what's our precision? Our precision is like 10%. Like 90% of the samples are actually false positives above that same threshold. So the histogram is a really useful way to visualize that the importance of class imbalance or class distribution shifts in affecting your metrics. Okay, I'm going to skip through calibration. We don't have time to talk about it, but I'll just kind of show you the takeaway. The idea of a calibrated model is that if your model outputs 0.9, then like 90% of that time, the class actually has the positive sample. And if your model outputs 0.2, then only 10% of the time, the class actually has that sample. Machine learning models are not calibrated. So that's not what's happening, even if you use a softmax or a sigmoid to map your scores to the range of 0 to 1, right? And based on this slide, you can kind of see why that's not happening, because like as soon as there's a distribution shift, or as soon as there's like a shift in one of these histograms, it would completely mess up the calibration that you might have done on your model. Yeah, I'm going to skip this, but I'll just show the most popular type of calibration, which is called like temperature scaling. It's a variant on Platt scaling. And all it does is like fit a logistic regression model from the scores that your model is giving you, so that you can like have this model of what you think the probability of a positive class is based on the score. And yeah, it's completely after training. Yeah.
And it needs to be done, like he was pointing out, it needs to be done on your on your test. So basically, in order to calibrate, if you're going to use it on a new data set, you need to try to label representative data in that data set and then calibrate on that data. And that's super hard to do if one of the things in your data set's really rare, because I'm just gonna go find the one example of the rare thing. It's like kind of really hard. It's like a needle in a haystack problem.
Yeah, so calibration is really hard. Yeah, you have to do it on like data that's representative of what you're going to use it on. And there's a few different methods that we can talk about in more detail, but this one, this paper here is the one that you'll see pop up pretty often. Okay, we're out of time. Yeah, so I'm just going to put back up the questions that we started with, and just take a minute to think about whether you might be able to answer some of these questions, given the things that we talked about today. What's next, Sarah?
Work time.
Oh yeah, work time is next.
Yeah.
Okay, sweet.
So stretching. These classifications, sorry. I didn't fully understand this calibration stuff. Is it more like, firstly, is it more like a number I put at the end on my paper saying like, if you're gonna use modeling for this production, pay attention to the number?
The point is like the model like 0.9 that comes out of your as a score is not the probability that the sample has the class of interest, right? But you might be able to do calibration so that you can give a probability that any sample has the class of interest based on the score. So it's a way of mapping those scores from your model to an actual probability that the class has the sample.
And this is, it's useful for some other, like one reason you might want this is like as ecologists, we often, you often might now actually get all these results out of a model for a new set of data, and then want to actually use those in some downstream statistical model. And the ability to say the probability of this occurrence is this, as opposed to binary saying like, definitely this absolutely was something that wasn't, potentially could be something you might want to do. It's actually, it turns out it's kind of hard, but Sam's lab does some really cool work in that space. Like, how do you actually understand how to track, like from scores in machine learning models to something that's semi-calibrated to actually utilizing continuous scores in statistical models.
Yeah, we can continue talking about it more. Not quite, actually. It's a little bit different from prior. Yeah, we can talk about the statistical models, but
I have a question about the gradient salience maps. You go back to that slide. Do you have any example where plotting the gradient salience maps was actually useful? Like, I feel like these are really cool tools, and it kind of satisfies my need for like, oh, I'm using this black box models, and now I understand what it's doing. But do I actually understand what it's doing, and has that ever been useful for you in practice?
It helped us find that Bushnell logo thing.
yeah.
So it's good for helping you understand if something's going drastically wrong. Like the strongest contributing factor to predicting the category of interest is not even on the animal at all, is like a kind of a bad sign.
Yeah, maybe one more example from this image is like, there's a little bit of a fine grained thing happening here where there's actually like a song and a call of this species. And what we're interested in is the song. But what the model is actually paying most attention to is this call, the reap. And so if like, we might look at this and say like, actually like, I want to detect the song of this species, not just this call. So maybe I should change my training data to not even include the calls and only include the songs. Because otherwise it's going to be predicting all these things that aren't really the male like defending its territory. So kind of gives insight into like, what is it about your positive samples that it's paying attention to, even if it's getting them right. Cool.
This was a fantastic question. Yeah.
Oh, thanks.
The work time, and I think like at a meta level, like it would be an amazing goal if all of you can be trying to figure out